That's it.
I am
1650 is what?
second semester junior year.
What is 1600?
Yeah. Yep.
I'm thinking next semester. I don't know if anybody's going to figure out.
Yeah.
So 16 and 97.
It's like this.
Actually, I'm not. I wish I was. It was left-handed.
Caitlin's left-handed, but she doesn't like the left-handed.
I don't like the left-handed. Really? I kind of like them as a right-handed person because I can rest my hand that's not working.
No, that's what I like doing. I just rest my other hand.
I feel bad for saying to learn everything that way from the world who's not good at basic stuff. Like I watch Alex Whitford is left-handed and she writes like this.
Wait, what?
So you're just like turning like she literally writes like above and down.
I just taught my brother writing that. He's writing.
Yeah.
But no, my brother's writing.
So when she's writing, she writes like this. Almost, yeah. It's kind of what is that?
6 people.
So she doesn't smear it with her hand, but like
5 right
out of
now.
the way.
I remember 6. It's been weird.
I just like CC.
But good.
I was just
Meeting
like,
lots of interesting people. So, yeah.
Right from like the top.
All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Glad we are all here and before the storm hits for the night. So exciting stuff. Okay, when I left you last on Monday, today's Wednesday. Yes, sorry. When I left you, we were talking about the whole idea of Cato and Cato a tragedy, and I think some very interesting things that come out of that. Today, I want to be a little bit more definitional and try and figure out what really matters in terms of what the founders are thinking about. So when we look at the American founding, we almost always date it from about 1761 up until about 1793. Now, these dates aren't exact. There's a bit of fluidity in those dates. But it is, as you can tell, roughly a 30-year time span, right around 30 years, 2 decades, in which we have this founding. And we start around 761 because there's a really incredible moment that happens with a guy named James Otis, a name that we're not going to talk a lot about in here, but you should at least know who he is. And we usually end it around 1793 for a lot of reasons, but in particular because that's the year that the cotton gin is developed. And the cotton gin changes the whole nature of American slavery. And slavery had been on the decline dramatically prior to this. And once you have the development of the cotton gin, it really it makes everybody, and not in a good way, rethink the economic efficiency and the need for slavery in America. And it becomes something, whereas it had been unacceptable for the most part in 1790 and was on its way out, it becomes acceptable with the cotton gin, but not quite. It's much more complicated than that. But essentially those are the 2 dates. So 1761 and 1793. And one of the questions that we should all ask, even though every one of us has grown up with knowing what the Declaration is and knowing what the Constitution is, and you wouldn't be in a place like Hillsdale unless you had some desire to learn a little bit more about those things and believe in them. We've all grown up with them, but I think in a sense that's a disservice to us and also to the founding because we take too much for granted. And we have to kind of figure out what is it that these guys were trying to do, and we need to humanize them a little bit, even though I love kind of thinking of the demigod aspects of them as well, the mythological aspects. We've got to make them real. And we'll see here over the next couple of classes that as high as their ideals could be, these were still men in every way. And they're not as crazy as, say, I don't know how many of you watched the State of the Union last night, but when you have the Speaker of the House ripping up the President's speech on national television, this is just outrageous in all kinds of ways, whatever you think of the president. It's just crazy, and it does not speak well of our present system right now or what's going on in politics. We're at a really horrible moment in terms of constitutional stability. What's that, Debbie?
Jackson-style dueling, bring it back.
Well, that would solve a lot. There's no question about that. Imagine if we just had Schiff and Trump duel each other rather than go through all those weeks of investigation. And, yeah, it would have solved a lot. But anyway, that's a good topic. It would have been a lot cheaper for the taxpayer, I think, had we done it that way. But clearly, that's not where we were. So what I want us to think about is, and you should all be wondering this, right? You should be thinking about this. If we're talking about, and not, I ask you guys to think about it, not just because you'll have to think about it for your midterm, but also because it's important as Americans. How did we go from being this country of total weirdos, like the Puritans and these people in the Virginia aristocracy, and how did we go from these really particular types of cultures that hated each other to actually being unified for a moment? And we've talked about the Great Awakening and the influence of evangelical Protestantism on America. And we've talked a little bit about the scientific basis of the Enlightenment and what happens with that. But that still can't be enough. I mean, just imagine for a moment, we're living in a tenuous time. But when we're talking about Americans in 1775, we're talking about a people who are really, really conservative, who look backward to almost everything, and yet they're willing to take up arms against their government and overthrow it. That's an incredible change in population, just from the way that they're thinking about what's going on in America. So we have to ask, what is it that gives the founders the mindset that allows them to rebel, to create something new, to go against what they've always been taught, and especially when they do believe, as much as they've governed themselves, they still think of themselves as loyal Englishmen. So how can they do that? And that's really hard for any of us. I've spent my entire professional career studying this, and it's difficult. I mean, even at age 52, I still don't quite get it all. There's a lot going on that is really hard to understand and to figure out, well, how could they do this? How could they change? And then why do they make such colossal mistakes? Things like allowing slavery to continue. Can you imagine how different the country would be if they had just gotten rid of that federal institution the moment they had the chance to? And they did have the chance to, and they didn't do it. So we've got to ask, well, why? What goes on here? How could they get so much right and get so much wrong, and yet establish something that is, at least in a promissory way, better than anything that's ever existed before? And that's part of this accomplishment too, that they're able to get this thing done and really establish a republic. So I want to start, we'll go back and talk about James Otis in a moment, but I want to start with page 127 and the Declaration. And again, I know that you're all familiar with this. Right? Every one of us who's grown up in America is familiar with this, and we've heard it in a million different contexts and in a million different ways. And of course, being in Hillsdale, we especially cherish it. Not that there are others who don't, but we really cherish it here, and for good reason. And what do we see? So turn to page 128. Right away, we get these two fascinating paragraphs that give us a philosophical understanding and basis of three things. We get an understanding of God. We get an understanding of man, and I mean that broadly, right? Men and women. And we get an understanding of nature. So all those things, God, the human person, and nature, are all fundamentally a part of these first two paragraphs, where there is truly a declaratory statement about what the definition of the human person is, and what does that matter in terms of political society, right? Just right away. And this is not totally uncommon now to have statements of philosophy, bless you, Ruth, to have these statements of philosophy at the beginning of some kind of document, but it was rare in 1776 to do this. And the fact that the founders don't just issue a legal statement, but actually issue a deeply philosophical statement is very telling about who they are but also what they expected us to be. They expect the best of us. They are not expecting us to be cheap. They're not expecting us to be cowardly. They are expecting the absolute best of each one of us by being their best and by making this declaration. Who are you? What do you want? What does this mean? These are the kinds of questions that they're asking right away, and they're also willing to answer them. So we have this incredible statement here, just a philosophical statement. And it's blunt. There are not a lot of subtleties about it. One of the things we can say about American history, at least up into the 20th century, and I mentioned this on the first day of class, but I realize it's been, 4 weeks now. When we look at documents and we think about what the documents say in American history, it is very, very rare for any American thinker or politician to hide their language. We as a people are very earnest, and we tend to state exactly what we think. Everybody else be damned. If they don't get it, they don't get it. We've said it, and we mean it. So this kind of political manipulation, or the idea that Machiavelli might have, where we couch our language one way and do another thing, that is not a part of the American psyche. If the founders say it, they believe it. And that's one of the greatest things about the American tradition. And Europeans think of us as soft and unsophisticated, not very intellectual, a little too hyper about our beliefs. That's just our character. Our character is very much take it or leave it, here's what we believe. And we've been that way for a very long time. Only recently have we started apologizing for that. But for most of our history, that was what it was. We stayed our beliefs, and we lived by them, and we die by them. And violence was always a part of American history. I mean, you brought this up jokingly, Devin, and I'm joking too. I mean, it would be crazy to have, a duel publicly, but yet it was very much a part. Of course, right? We state for the government censors who are listening right now, right? But it would be a little chaotic. But we also know that in American history, there has always been the threat of violence. It's one of the things that we see constantly. That basically we believe this, and we are willing to die for it. And that it's part of our character that we do that, and we see that throughout the Declaration as well. So right away, you have this opening statement. When in the course of human events, okay. Opening line's already incredible. We've got a philosophy of history here. When in the course of human events, right? We recognize that there is something that all human beings go through, and history is not some kind of weird abstraction. It's a reality that holds us together. Time holds us together, and we are in time. It becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature. You guys probably got sick of talking about natural law during Western Heritage, and yet there it is now. Now you know why we spend so much time on it in Western Heritage. It's so important. What are the laws that we see written in creation itself and of nature's God? Right? So who wrote those laws? Laws of nature, nature's God. Nothing too deistic in that statement. They just told us we're studying the laws of nature. Now we want to know who's the author of that. The author of that is God. And then I don't think we need to be cagey about this. They didn't say, oh, and we mean the Trinitarian God as explained in the Nicene Council. They didn't have to do that. Everybody knew what they were talking about. It's God. It's God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. That's what they're talking about. And we can apologize for that. We can be embarrassed about it, but we can't deny it. That's what they're talking about. They're being very blunt here about their statement. This is the author of those laws of nature. This is nature's God. That entitle them a decent respect. So notice this. I love this. This is American earnestness. We may totally disagree with you in every way, but we owe it to you as a human being to tell you what we think, even if you think we're insane. We owe it as one person to another to be honest. And so we're going to say this. And this is not propaganda. Right? They mean this. King George, we're telling you exactly what's gone wrong. We've been telling you, and you haven't been listening. Now it's enough. Right? We're done. We've explained to you since 1761 where England is messed up and has not allowed us to do what we want. It's now 1776. We gave you 15 years. You blew it. Now it's done. Right? We have been patient. We have been kind. We have been waiting, and you've done nothing. So here it is. What do? So we are now separating, and we shall declare the causes that impel us to that separation. Now, interesting as well, notice who the blame belongs to. We've been impelled to do this. Nice use of language there. Right? You kind of forced us into this because you didn't do your job. You had one really important job. That was to love and respect us as a king. You didn't do any of that. In fact, you treated us horribly. So we have been forced to take this step. Now we're going to state exactly what we believe. And again, no artifice in any of this. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Right? And we're frankly sorry that you're so dumb that you don't know these, but we're going to state them. Right? That's what the founders are saying. Right? We're now going to state these truths because they should have been self-evident. You should have been able to figure them out because every reasonable person can. That all men, and you guys can circle, you can square, put whatever mark you want around all, but you've got to stress the all there. Because no matter what failings the founders had, they have just thrown the gauntlet down. And at some point, even if not immediately, at some point, this has to be made real for all persons everywhere. Black, white, male, female, Jew, Gentile, everybody has to be a part of this. Because, and this is the whole point of the Declaration, if we can't speak of all men who ever have existed or ever will exist, this counts for nothing. This is either true or it's not. And if it's true, it is true for every person who has ever lived or who ever will live. If it's not true, then we've totally screwed up. But we're saying this is true. And what we're saying is that all men, and of course, there's no asterisk there. It doesn't say, oh, we're excluding people from Africa or we're excluding women. It doesn't say that. Right? All persons, all men in the language of the day, everybody, past, present, and future, are created equal. Okay, well, how does that work? Because it's clear just looking around the room right now, we're obviously not all equal. There are things you guys do that are better than what I can do. And there's certain things I can do that are probably better than what you can do. Partly that's just age. Now, I've had a lot more experience doing these things than you have. And my guess is that I'm probably a better parent right now than any one of you. Anyone want to deny that? It doesn't mean I'm a good parent, but I bet I'm better than you. None of you are parents, right? Probably not supposed to ask that legally, but anyway. Yeah. So, I mean, there are just certain things. So, what do we mean by this equality? What does that mean? Yeah, please.
We're equal in rights and obligations.
Yes, exactly, right? This is what matters. What matters is that we are equal in the way we treat one another and the way we expect to be treated. So it's not saying that we all have the same qualities. It's not saying that we all will end up in the same place or that we all started in the same place as at every level. We're not animals, and yet we are. We're not insects of the hive. We're individuals. And that means we make choices. And that means we make good choices. And it means we make bad choices. End of discussion. That's who we are. We are really complicated. I'm really complicated. You're really complicated. Every person on the earth, all 7 billion of us, are unbelievably complicated. That's a lot of complications running around. That's a lot of people interacting, trying to move around. So how could we all be equal? Well, exactly as you said, we are equal in our duties, our obligations, and our rights. And so what are those? Well, how do we know we're created equal? Because what is equal? We have been endowed by our Creator. Second mention of God. Notice it's not a small c. They're not hiding here. This is our Creator. This is the Judeo-Christian God right there. Specifically, I mean, this is the Christian part. By their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Now, it's kind of an odd word. As far as we know, this word unalienable had never been used before. It should have been inalienable, but it means the same thing. Basically, I cannot take these rights and alienate them from who you are. So if I look at Stephanie, Stephanie must by definition possess these rights. She cannot alienate them from herself, and I cannot alienate them from her. They cannot be foreign to who she is. They must be absolutely a part, fundamentally, of the very definition of her being. And what are these then? Now notice, they're not the only ones. But among these, so there may be ones we don't know, but among these rights, we have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right? Those are good. Those are really good. And if governments actually lived by that, they'd be really, really good too. Now, look around the world right now. Look at what's going on in Hong Kong. These unbelievably noble people who are striving against tyranny. And what gives them hope? This statement. This is what's animating them right now. Right now, as they are doing their best to weather a tyrannical government, their hope is in these few lines of the Declaration. They want this to be true. They want us to recognize it as being true. And this is the case. Hong Kong and the people living there are not American nationalists. They're Republican patriots, small r Republican. They are striving to figure out what holds every one of us together. Male, female, black, white, male. It doesn't matter, right? What all human beings share. And it inspires them. And they could get crushed. I mean, it's amazing. China has been as quiet as they've been about this. But my gosh, the fact that they're doing this is incredible. And who knows what's going to happen. And that to secure these rights, right? Notice secure them. Government does not give them to you. Government cannot take them away from you. They are inalienable. They can never, ever be separated from the human person, ever. But in order to secure these, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So the human person has this absolute need for someone to help secure what these things are. They're already there. I am already fully human from the moment I was conceived in the womb. I was fully human because at that moment I had life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. No matter how little I could move or change or make decisions, basically none when it comes to decision making at that point. But regardless, right, we consider the child up until about age 7 or 8 in trust. They still have the same rights, but their guardianship has been given to another in trust for a bit of time. Not long, but we all go through that. None of us escapes that. That's part of what it means to be in a family. And so we have these rights, and therefore we need to secure them. Now here's the irony of all of this, and it's the sad part. If we take what Thomas Jefferson is writing here seriously, it means that every single person from Adam and Eve all the way to the very final person who will be born in this earth, without exception, that every single human being ever is endowed with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That would be unquestionable. But what's questionable then is why is it that in the history of humanity, so very few people have ever enjoyed those rights? It's something we all take for granted. And I think our government's a little out of control right now, and it's been out of control for about 100 years. But regardless, it's a personal opinion. You can agree or disagree about that. Nobody at this moment, doesn't matter what I say, and you guys know I record lectures, nobody at this moment is going to rush in here in the name of the government and demand us to stop talking. It's not going to happen. They may use other ways of trying to quiet us and keeping things, and they may do things that are terrible. I think the TSA is unconstitutional. But regardless, it doesn't matter. They have their manipulations. They do what they do. But I can still utterly speak my mind in this classroom. Now, you may challenge me. You may put it on social media, and get peer pressure to stop me from doing something. You may make me apologize. I'm not saying you would or that I would, but you could do that. But none of you is going to call the ATF or the FBI and have a raid on this class. And if you did, it would be an absurdity, right? And it would be thrown out of court pretty quickly, no matter what damage was done. So we still, in the huge line of human experience, we are really, really, really blessed because we still have most of these rights. And if we have lost them, it's our own fault. We've given it. We've caved in on certain things. We may be able to reclaim them, but we'll see. So this is the problem. Every single human being has these rights. Hardly anyone has ever enjoyed them. And that's what makes something like the Declaration and then making it work so, and not a word I use very often, but it fits perfectly here, it's precious. It's just rare for something like this to work. Most people would probably enjoy it. Most people don't get it. So this is what we have. And now that means something because we then have to figure out why is it that most people have not experienced this? And what is it that made the American experience not only figure out what was true, but then live it out? That's a harder question. How could they actually make this thing real and then live it out? And why is it, remember I drew that picture on the board on Monday at the Revolution. Most places where we see revolution, what do we find afterwards? Years and years of counter-revolutions and more counter-revolutions and insurgencies and people upset and us and them. We didn't do that. Did the Federalists and Anti-Federalists go to war? In almost every other country, they would have. Almost every other country. What do they do here? They fight like mad, and then after they've debated all day, they go out and have a beer or wine together. You guys realize how unusual that is? It just doesn't happen. Now, granted, we blow it, and we have a civil war. Over necessary things, we have a civil war. And it takes a while. So we're not without our problems by any means. But the fact that you could have two completely divergent groups fighting for a U.S. Constitution and what it might or might not be, and that they go home afterwards with hardly any fighting, a little, but hardly any, it's stunning. Mexico still is having chaotic problems going back to their 1910 revolution and their 1917 revolution. They're still, look at France. Did you guys watch the news this weekend? See what's going on in France? All the firefighters in Paris came out and had a street brawl, a real street brawl, with all the policemen. I mean, can you imagine if in New York City, the firefighters and the police spent the entire weekend beating the snot out of each other? Right? And that's what makes, regardless of who's in power, that's what makes ripping up a speech on national television so dangerous. Because it just shows how tenuous the fabric of society is. Right? There are better ways to prove you're right than to be an ass. Right? There are much better ways. And yet, it's hard. It's so hard. And frankly, what we saw on TV last night is the norm for human history. It's not the norm for us, but it's the norm for human history. And that's what's so incredible and devastating about all of this. So what does the government exist for? Well, it exists for one reason, to secure those natural rights for you. And the Declaration is quite clear that whenever any form of government, notice that, any form, they're not pulling punches here. Any form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of that people to abolish it. In fact, I would go even further and say it may not just be a right, it may be a duty. It may be a duty to challenge that tyranny. Because that tyranny is denying you your very humanity. That's what these guys are saying here. It's basically saying, you are our slaves. We own you. Can't do that. Right? That means we're null and void. You cannot do that. So that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and their happiness. Now, we've got to be careful. we can get ticked off pretty easily. We've got to make sure that every time we're mad, we don't overthrow our government. Right? That would be terrible. That would be just as bad as having an oppressive government, because that becomes a tyranny in its own way. So prudence, just remember back to heritage class, the highest of the virtues, the first of the virtues, prudence. Prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude, but always prudence, number one. Prudence, anybody remember? Those of you who have me better remember this. What's the exact definition of prudence? And it's what the founders here mean. And those of you who had me, you now know why I forced you to memorize this, because I was waiting for this one moment. Anybody?
Right thing at the right time?
Yeah, that's very close. It's very close. Prudence is the ability to discern that which is good from that which is evil. That's it. Straightforward. Is it good or is it evil? So prudence, indeed, the ability to choose good from evil, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. Now, just imagine, these guys waited 15 years to do this. And I'm going to give you a story here in a moment to help explain this. But 15 years, right? That's incredible that they waited that long. And even after fighting broke out, they still waited a full year after fighting broke out to declare their independence. They still thought for that first year that maybe they could work this out. That's patience. That's a lot of patience. So we know that when these guys say that, this is not just propaganda. Right? They mean this. Look, we waited 15 years, a decade and a half. It's enough time. That's almost a full generation. You should have gotten this right, and you didn't. So now it's over. Right? Again, no more. And now I want to point out one other thing in this, and then I want to tell you a story, one of my favorite stories. I want to tell you about what all this means and how do you figure this out. But if you jump down, so we've got those first two paragraphs. When in the course of human events, and then we hold these truths to be self-evident. Notice when we get down to line 29 on page 128. From here forward, he has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good, for the republic, the res publica, the public good. So from this point forward, line 29, all the way through page 129, all the way through page 130 to the very bottom there, we therefore, the representatives of the United States, okay, all of that is a list of grievances. And we always skip over these. Any of you who had to memorize the Declaration in grade school or high school, did you ever have to memorize this part? And nobody ever remembers this part. And yet, in many ways, it's the heart of the Declaration, because this is where it's suddenly the Magna Carta. And that's intentional. This is a rewriting of the great document of 1215. It is the Magna Carta. This is the list of everything you messed up, King. Everything you did wrong. And how do we know that you did it wrong? Because our tradition of common law has always taught us that we hold in common certain rights, like the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, the right not to be held with very high bail, the right to habeas corpus to our bodies, that the government does not get our bodies, even if we've committed a crime. Right? All of those things, to a right to a trial by jury. We have had these things for time immemorial. You have now violated all of them. So what we see in the whole Declaration, first two paragraphs are philosophical. Everything up until the challenge at the end is all a grievance of common law. We're now showing you exactly what you did wrong. We're not just spouting off. These are your criminal aspects. This is what you failed at and why we're moving away from you. And then look at what we have at the end. You guys think about this for a moment. Hopefully from what we've talked about in class so far this semester, this should be clear. But when they add at the end on page 131, and for support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. What did they just make this? What did this document just become? This is not Jefferson's original. Congress adds this to Jefferson's original. Camden?
A covenant?
Yeah, it's a covenant. We just made it a covenant. Right? So Now we don't have a choice. We just brought God in. So now this is life or death. And these guys are serious. If George Washington's caught, they're going to execute him. Of course they will, for treason. So now they've put this in the court of God. Now God will decide. And we'll do our best, but in the end, this is in God's providence. That's incredible. So we have this mixing. Think about that. We've got a mixing of natural law, natural rights, common law, and Old Testament theology, all thrown in. Right? It's amazing to bring all that together. Okay, any questions on that? And there's still more we need to talk about, but I just want to, there are no questions. I want to tell you a story, one of my favorites, Devin.
Yes, sir. I hope I'm not jumping too far ahead.
Oh, that's
this
okay.
One. But it's there's been kind of an ongoing on and off debate on the blog site, the Law and Liberty website, about jumping into the Constitution and to the extent whether the Declaration of Independence or whether the founders understood the Declaration to have kind of a relationship. And I see it, even when I read the stuff, it weirdly kind of becomes kind of a contest between the history departments and the political philosophy majors.
Sure.
But just did the founders consider the Declaration as the creation of a union or an established government the way we look at it as a type of statute?
Yes, they did and they didn't. So a lot depends, and it depends on which founder you're talking about too. But of the people who signed the Declaration, they definitely saw this as the beginning of something. Now, whether they saw it at the beginning of a union of republics or saw it as the beginning of the nation, that is a very open question. But there's no doubt they saw this as ratifying what had been going on. But by the time that the founders write the Declaration, there had already been something like 200 declarations of independence already written by localities and churches. So they're slow. One of the things that the founders are doing is playing catch up. So there's a lot going on behind this before, and that means that they have to grab, in order for this to work, they have to be able to get a hold of the attention that's being given at the moment. But Devin, if you don't mind, we will talk a lot more about this.
Yes, sir.
But we're going to draw this out over the next couple of classes.
Not a problem.
Thank you. It's a great question. Really great. Okay, anybody else? Okay, so one of my favorites. We have this interesting moment, and this is in April of 1775, and April 18th through the 19th of 1775. And Boston is really the heart of American patriotism at this point. That is the heart of those who are most radically trying to promote some kind of independence from Britain. Now, how far we're going to go is still an open question, but they're trying to get this and trying to figure out how this might work. So Boston is put under martial law in 1774. So there are troops all over Boston, British troops, called lobsterbacks because of wearing the red coats. So you've got these guys who are all over Boston, putting it under martial law, but out into the countryside of Massachusetts, you've got a lot of hubs of revolutionary activity. And the main city outside of Boston, where most of the revolutionary activity is going on, is a place called Concord. Now, Concord is about 20 miles from Boston, from downtown Boston. And there's a road that goes to Concord, but as it goes to Concord, it goes through a really small, sleepy little town called Lexington. And at Lexington, in the middle of the town, there's a green, and the road diverges. So from Boston to Lexington, once you're in Lexington, you can either go on to Concord or you can go up to New Hampshire. Right? So it's a small area in New England here, very small area. In this space right here where the two roads meet, we have a town green. So all of this is the town green, and it's huge. So if I were to stand at one edge of the town green, let's say I'm right here at the edge of the town green, and I wanted to look across the green, I would be looking past the Dow Center into that next block. This is big, basically all of the campus here would be about the size of the green. Now, there are a couple of buildings here that they're not there anymore, not all of them at least, that really matter. The one right here at the corner where this meets is the church. And it's these are Puritans. These are old Puritans, Congregationalist church there. And the pastor of that church is a really interesting guy by the name of Jonas Clark. Someone that we've almost entirely forgotten, but we should. Interesting guy. On the other side here is the local tavern. Remember, they're Puritans. They don't mind drinking at all. So you've got the local tavern still there. And then next to the tavern, you've got the pastor's house. So Clark's house is right here. And we'll put a little cross on it so you know that's Clark's house. Give you a little beer mug here. Kind of, not bad. Okay. Oh, and this is the church. Okay, so, bad cross. All right. So what happens on April 18th of 1775, and you guys all know at least this part of the story, what happens is that the British start marching into the countryside, and they've been given orders to arrest Sam Adams, John Hancock, and any of the other great leaders of the revolution, and it's presumed that they're in Concord. So the British troops start moving, and the British troops, they're huge numbers, about 6,600 total of these troops that are marching down this road. Paul Revere goes forward, and this is his famous night, one if by land, two if by sea. And just a few minutes to midnight, he makes it to Jonas Clark's house and knocks on the door just a few minutes to midnight on late April 18th. And Clark is kind of frustrated and opens the door, wants to know what's going on. And Paul Revere tells him, you've got nearly 7,000 troops moving this way. You're going to have to decide what you're going to do. Now, are you going to fight? Are you going to let them go through? What's going to happen? Now, this gets really tough. And I want you to just imagine this. You're a little community. Your community is an old community. You've been there since the beginning of New England. And everybody in the town is pretty much related to everybody else in some way or another. You know every single person. You all go to the same church. Remember when I told you guys about New England congregations? The community is the congregation, and the congregation is the community. So these are people you live with, you've grown up with, you've married, everybody was all right there. And so now Paul Revere is telling Clark, you've got these troops moving. They're coming into your community. What are you going to do? Clark doesn't know what to do. He's a great guy, and he's been a great pastor, and he's been giving all kinds of sermons for years on what does it mean to be a real human being, what would Jesus demand, and so forth. And he's a patriot, but he's also a devout Puritan Christian. And so they ring the town bells. And I just want you guys to imagine this scene. So they ring the town bells at midnight. Everybody in the town comes out. Everybody. Women, children, everybody comes in. They all come in and they meet right here in these three places. In the church, in the pub, and in the pastor's house. And they debate. The whole community at midnight, they debate, what are we going to do? It's incredible. And they don't know when the troops are going to get there. The estimate is that the troops will be marching through at about 4:30 in the morning. And so these guys debate. And Clark tells them, he says, look, real men stand up and fight for what they believe. But no matter what, we're going to get crushed. If they've really got 6,600 troops, there's nothing we can do. And so finally, about 4:15 in the morning, they make their decision. The 42 men who are there with guns are going to stand on the village green, but they're going to stand in parade formation, meaning they're going to honor the troops as they go by. They're not in fighting position. They're in parade formation with their weapons on their shoulders held like this, not with the hands on the trigger, nothing like that. They're showing it as a demonstration, and they're wearing their community colors. We're basically saying, you guys march through. We're not going to do anything, but you better know that we believe in this community. It's what we are. And so about 4:20, 5 minutes later, they see these troops coming through right at the edge of the village green. Now, remember what I said, how long this is. So you've got the British, the equivalent of the Marines. At this point, they're called Fusiliers. But you've got the British who are right here. And all the way on the other side of the Dow Center, they see 42 men on the quad holding their weapons at parade formation. It's not even that bright out. It's 4:30 in the morning, 4:20 in the morning. But they see him. And they could have easily, so the troops are marching like this, the militia's standing about right here, and they could have easily just gone on to Concord and ignored it. But no, they're offended. The British are offended. And so they cross through, right here across the green, and everybody's outside. The whole village, all the kids, they're all in the houses right here on the streets, moms, everybody's all right there. You've got the whole village, and you've got these 42 guys lined up. And the British officer in charge goes up, and they've got their weapons ready, and they tell the militia, stand down. And the militia says, okay. They're pretty shocked. They weren't expecting this, and they start moving their weapons down. We don't know what happens. A shot's fired. We don't know who fired it. To this day, we have no idea who fired it. Could have been someone in the tavern. It could have been one of the soldiers on the field. It could have been a militiaman. We have no idea. This is the shot that's heard around the world. And the moment that shot opens up, all the British who are right there just line their guns up, and they fire right into the militia and into the civilians. Just open fire right on them. And 10 guys die right away. But one guy, just think about how personal this is. One of the guys out on the quad was the town physician, who's the doctor for the whole town. And the bullet went right into his guts, and all of his innards spilled out. The bullet was so close, got him like that, it just peeled open his stomach, everything spills out. He literally crawled across the quad, across the street, to where his wife and kids were on the porch watching from about 20 feet away. And he hugs them goodbye and dies. This is how personal this was. This is incredible. And yet, what matters? Well, what matters is the British showed their true colors. These guys weren't doing anything. Everybody at Lexington, they're just being people. They were just doing what they needed to do. They weren't even being hostile. And the British attack. And then what happens? The British keep moving, and they go to Concord. And word has gotten out everywhere in New England what's happened. My gosh, the British have attacked civilians, and they attacked a civilian militia. And thousands of farmers come out. Just farmers everywhere. These are really ticked off people who will be Americans within a minute. Right? They're still New Englanders, but they're on the edge of being American. And they walk out to the road, and they see these 6,600 troops, and farmers line up on the brick walls on either side of the church, other side of the road, and they just start pelting the British. And the British have to retreat all 20 miles running back to Boston. Yeah, what a moment in history. We often wouldn't we want, and when we think about the way it's presented to us, don't we think that Jefferson gives this rousing speech to Congress and everybody signs the Declaration and then we have war? It's not like that at all. It's totally messy and yet totally innocent in so many ways. These people in Lexington were just being what they have always been, and the British weren't allowing them to be what they were. That's incredible. So all of the founding starts right there when that first bullet is fired at Lexington. And amazingly enough, we really do go from these are Puritan New Englanders to Americans within a minute. That's it. This is where America is born. Has anybody in here been to Lexington Green? Yeah, it's incredible. You feel it. There's something odd about the place. It feels reverent in some kind of way. It's an incredible place. I took my kids there. It's been now probably 12 years when they were little. And man, just an amazing place. You feel it, and the revolution becomes very, very real at that moment. So here's the point. The founding is both very high and philosophical, and it's also just very normal in so many ways. It's about us. It is truly about normal people trying to figure out how to make their way through this hell. If that's not a metaphor for life, I don't know what it is. So, all right, thanks, guys. I'll see you on, no new readings yet, but I'll see you on Friday, and we'll keep going here with these founding documents. And we're going to read some things in class together, but I still want to talk about some ideas dealing with natural law and natural rights.